Hello, everyone. I'm Gilbert Cruz, and this is the Book Review Podcast. It's the middle of March, so despite the temperature outside here in New York, we're already thinking about spring books. Hopefully you've had some time to browse through our spring preview, 19 nonfiction books to check out and 22 fiction books. Many of those are out this very month. March is a great month for books. For you nonfiction enthusiasts, I'm going to mention 3. There's a new work by Matthew Desmond, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Evicted, whose new book looks at poverty in America. It's called Poverty by America. There's a new book about the royal family by Sally Bedell Smith titled George VI and Elizabeth, the Marriage That Saved the Monarchy. That's about Queen Elizabeth II's father, who assumed the throne after his brother King Edward VIII abdicated to marry the American Wallis Simpson. And there is King, A Life by Jonathan Eig, which is the first major biography of Martin Luther King Jr. in quite a while. But that's a look ahead. Today, we at the TBR, which is what we call the book review, are going to have a little roundtable discussion, checking in with a few staffers about what they're reading at the moment, new and old. We're going to call it the TBR's TBR pile. I don't know if that completely tracks, but we're going to roll with it anyway. Joining me today are Jen Szalai, the nonfiction critic here at the Book Review. Hello, Jen.
Hi, Gilbert.
Sadie Stein, a preview editor at the Book Review. Hello, Sadie.
Hi.
And Joumana Khatib, an editor here who works on news and features and all manner of fun stuff. Hello, Joumana.
Hi, Gilbert.
I am going to start with Jen, who is reading a couple things, but she's actually not reading. She's listening, which is basically reading. If you listen to audiobooks, you're reading.
Yeah, I did. I did want to mention actually a book that I had read in print a long time ago, probably a couple of decades ago, actually. And now I'm listening to in audiobook form, and it's The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. And I'm sure it's a book that many of our listeners are familiar with. And it's about a butler on this grand estate, and the estate has just passed hands from one Lord Darlington, whose family had owned it for ages, to an American. And so it takes place in the 50s, or at least it's initially set in the 50s. And this butler, Stevens, is traveling through the English countryside, and he's reflecting on his tenure at this great house. And, all sorts of memories come bubbling up. And as anybody who knows, who's read the book or perhaps seen the movie, which I actually haven't seen, but his narration, it's not quite unreliable because it does seem very authentic to him and who he is. And he's very much concerned with, did he live his life as a good butler? That's sort of the main thing he keeps returning to again and again. But in those interstitial moments, he's remembering things that happened at Darlington Hall. There's a dark history that he gets at. I don't want to give too much away for people who haven't read it. There's a dark history, dark undercurrent. There's also his own personal life. He's the child also of a butler. And so his relationship with his father, his ailing and aging father, is really quite both moving but also somewhat disturbing in the sense that this idea of propriety and duty just takes over Stevens's entire life to the point where his father is very sick and you think that there might be some sort of connection that would be established between them, and it's really quite muted. And so listening to it has been wonderful. I mean, the narration is great, and it's told in the first person, which I think is actually an ideal feature, at least for me, when I'm listening to an audiobook. It feels a bit like a conversation or a story that's a personal story that's being related to me. And it's been so long since I read the book that there are certain details that I hadn't remembered that keep coming up. And so it's been a nice experience. I'm going through it slowly. I sort of listen to it in little snatches here and there.
What's your relationship to Ishiguro's works?
That's the thing. I've only read, I think when I read this book, it might have been around the time that Never Let Me Go came out, which was maybe about 20 years ago.
It's 2005.
Okay, so 18 years ago. And I remember being really taken by that book and loving it. And so I read this one. And then I had meant to read the Unconsoled, and I haven't read it. So far, it's only 2 for me. But obviously, I'd like to read more.
Sadie, Joumana, have either of you read Remains of the Day?
Yeah, it's amazing. And I love the movie too, which isn't identical, but is one of the better Merchant Ivory adaptations, I think, and well worth watching.
Anthony Hopkins, is it?
And Emma Thompson.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm going to have to watch that, I think, after listening to this.
I read it when I had like a 4-day 100-degree fever, and I totally understand what you're saying about the comfort that comes from hearing this butler. Because I remember feeling actually very cared for hearing this butler. Like, I'm in some kind of other literal fever dream, hearing this man narrate and talk about service and did I do a good job? And I actually found that very comforting. I could not tell you if I retained any of the major plot points. So it's time to go back and revisit that story.
Ishiguro has been in the news for the past few months because he's nominated for an Oscar for his adaptation of the Kurosawa film Ikiru, which was made into a movie called Living with Bill Nighy. I think by the time this episode airs, the Oscars will be over and he probably will not have won. But he's definitely out there on the campaign trail. It's great to see him in the world outside of a book release.
Oh, yeah. I haven't seen the film, but I should see that too.
I interviewed him for another piece for the paper, and it was a profile of Luis Schwartz, who's his Brazilian publisher, and he said campaigning for this Oscar makes the Nobel look like nothing. That it is the most exhausting experience of his life.
Jen, you're also reading something British.
I know. Actually, it's very funny. I was on the subway reading an actual print book, which is a novel I just started called Look at Me by Anita Bruckner. It's my first Bruckner.
Oh
so I feel
God,
like this
Jen,
is kind of
really?
an event.
Wow.
Yeah.
You should send out a press release.
I feel like I have enough friends who have been telling me for a while that I need to read some Bruckner. And so this is the first one. I'm only maybe about 30 or 40 pages in, so I feel like I can't really totally comment knowledgeably about it yet. But I will say that in terms of the narrator, it's this woman. She works at a medical library in London, and she also has this interesting relationship to her work. From the outside, she presents as quiet, reserved. So some sort of commonality with the narrator of The Remains of the Day.
I think that's British.
And very British,
very
yes,
yeah.
Exactly. But she's also really drawn, it's interesting, because whereas the butler in The Remains of the Day is very much into this idea, this very old school idea of duty and obligation, and this is your station in life, and you respect that. She herself, at least at the beginning, she does mention this yearning, and I guess that's where the title comes in, where even though she presents as very quiet, that she wants people to pay attention to her, that's something that she really longs for.
I'd love to ask you about one more thing.
Sure.
You mentioned that you're listening to an audiobook that I've also listened to and was a big fan of. Which one is that?
Oh, yes. Recently, I listened to The Pigeon Tunnel by John le Carré, his memoir, and he reads it, and it's absolutely amazing. I mean, one can imagine, he himself, having had a career in intelligence, he's a good actor. He really does a really good job impersonating some of the different people he meets. Although I will say the one thing about these British narrators is I feel like their American accents are always super broad. All the Americans sound like this exaggerated. You imagine them wearing like a 10-gallon hat.
Have you ever heard an American try to do a British accent?
Well, that's the thing. I have to say maybe they do the American accent better than Americans do the British accents, because I feel like the different gradations of British class stuff that comes out through the accents, you can really sense it when somebody good is narrating it. And he's just a wonderful narrator of his own life.
Do you find that it enriches the experience to listen to an audio version that's read by the author when you're dealing with a memoir?
I have to say that I don't think I have much experience listening to audiobook memoirs that haven't been read by the authors. I imagine if the author is deceased, then they'll be read by an actor. I think as much as possible, it seems like they try to get the author themselves to read these books. And so another one I listened to, which was interesting. I enjoyed listening to it, was Sarah Polley's memoir, Run Towards the Danger. And again, a great actor herself. Like she not only is narrating her own life, but she's reliving these experiences and how she felt at certain times in her life that were obviously very formative and in some cases traumatic for her. And, you know, in some cases with these books, when you're listening to somebody tell you about their lives, it's like being on the receiving end of a long phone conversation from somebody who's very articulate and who's very, very good at telling the story. And so when it's done well, it's quite captivating.
I would say that the portions of the Keith Richards memoir, which he reads aloud, are far better than the portions in which people are doing kind of Jack Sparrow impersonations.
I don't see how anybody could possibly stand up to Keith Richards narrating his own life.
So I have to listen to that. I like the book itself.
Oh,
so
it's a great
so good.
audiobook and book.
We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Book Review Podcast. I'm here with Jen Szalai, Sadie Stein, and Joumana Khatib. We are talking about what we're reading and listening to at this moment. I'm going to turn to my right and ask Joumana what she's reading.
All right. Well, I have the kind of relationship with my doctor where if I'm lucky, I only see him once a year, and he always says, what should I read with my all-male book club? We like outer borough fiction. And I said, oh my gosh, you've got to read Deacon King Kong by James McBride. It's great. Before I knew it, my appointment was over. I hope they love it. I'll ask him in a year. And then I realized that I had never read the book that I think was really McBride's breakout, which is his memoir called The Color of Water. He grew up in a mixed-race family, and his mom was white and his father was black. Grew up in New York. They grew up in the Red Hook housing projects. He moved to Queens. But the thing that was really defining about his mother was that she was very circumspect about her racial background. It wasn't until McBride was an adult and had really pressed her that he found out that not only was she white, she was born in Poland to an Orthodox rabbi who then came to the States. But all throughout his childhood, and he had a very idiosyncratic childhood because his mother got married to a black man. She was cut off from her biological family, and then she ended up raising 12 mixed-race kids. Enough for a baseball team was kind of the running joke. And whenever any of James's siblings or James himself would ask his mom about what her life had been like, she would always say, I'm light-skinned, and that's the end of it. So eventually he's able to finally press her or wear her down and really dive into what it was like to grow up like this in the 70s in New York at a time when, you know, at this point they were living in Queens. And this is when there were a lot of Black Power rallies in the neighborhood. And James at once was like, I was so excited to see it, but I was also terrified this was going to come from my mother. And I didn't know what to make of it. So it's a very entertaining and completely engaging voice. It's obvious how much affection he has for his mother, who is a real eccentric. She's biking down Queens Boulevard, and she's working the overnight shift at Chase Bank in Manhattan, raising 12 kids. She's been widowed twice over. Fascinating.
I've never read The Color of Water. I've had that book since I was a teenager. I remember you have your copy here in the studio. I'm looking at it. It's very familiar to me. I had it in my household. I've never read it. What made you pick it up?
As I was talking about his novel, Deacon King Kong, and I was thinking about what I loved about that book, he has such an ear, and he has such an ear for dialogue and character and building and pacing. And I thought I would actually love to see, like, this is so obviously a New York book. And I just wanted to hear how he summoned his own childhood in New York. Like, I wanted to hear New York of the 70s, a part of New York that I had never heard before and may not hear again. Because, like, you know how the neighborhoods and communities change so fast. And he's hilarious in his fiction. He's very affectionate towards the people that you see in his books. And like one of the first phrases that struck me, it's on like page 10 or something. He's talking about he and his 11 siblings going to bed. His mom's tucking them in. At this point, they're still living in the Red Hook housing projects. And he says, She laid us down in bed like we were slabs of meat. And like, anybody else, you'd think, God, this woman should go to, we should get CPS on the horn or something. But like, you can tell in the way he's talking about that nighttime ritual in which he and his siblings felt like T-bone steaks in Red Hook, that like, this is actually a very affectionate and precise recollection of his mother. And I could instantly picture her.
That sounds great.
You got to read it, Gilbert.
I need to take it off I think it's on my mom's shelf in her
It's your
house.
to be read pile.
You're
Put it to the
right.
top of your TBR pile.
TBR.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Joumana. Sadie, what are you into? I think you're here to talk about a nonfiction book about spies.
Yeah. Well, it's one that was reviewed earlier this week, came out earlier this week, reviewed spectacularly by Ben McIntyre, who's a terrific writer. And this book is called The Dirty Tricks Department by John Lyle. And it is about the OSS, Office of Strategic Services, which was run by a chemist named Stanley Lavelle. And it's about all the Q-like crazy schemes they came up with in order to foil the Axis powers. Everything from foxes in radium-based paint swimming across the Chesapeake Bay, invisible ink, truth serums, exploding dough that was baked into exploding bread, pen guns, and being self-respecting spies, of course, umbrella guns too. One of the odder schemes was one to inject female hormones into Adolf Hitler's food in order that his voice become soprano, his mustache fall out, and he develop breasts, which they thought might lessen his hold on his acolytes.
Who is this book for?
Who is it not for? Who doesn't want to?
That's my thought.
Yeah,
Sounds
exactly.
great.
There's something for everyone. It should be said that I don't think it's a spoiler alert to say that most of these schemes did not come to fruition. Several went arguably much further than they should have. The foxes are one. The exploding bats is another. You can't say that no animals
That's
were
like the
harmed
animals? Oh.
in the filming. Yeah.
Like flying bats, not...
Flying bats. They were going to load them up with explosives and then unleash them. It was the forerunner of the CIA, which is, of course, fascinating. It involved a lot of what Churchill referred to as corkscrew minds, because they had a British equivalent, which included Ian Fleming, who obviously drew on this in writing James Bond. And some of them seem to have been flat out crazy. The ideas were ludicrous.
Well, didn't we see this a little later in the Cold War, they tried to get Castro's
Beard
cigars,
to fall out.
well, beard to fall out, it's exploding. Did I make up exploding
No,
cigars,
that's
or is
correct.
that Groucho
I'm pretty
Marx?
sure that's right.
They totally did.
That's right.
They were very into getting facial hair to drop out. This was, they would not.
You mean a
let
bunch
this
of
thing-
guys came up with this idea? That's what you're saying?
they would not let this go, and this was the secret to regaining American imperialism, I guess. And we can see the results. But Hitler's breasts apparently did not grow. I think they failed to inject the hormones into the food. That was always going to be a tricky one to perpetrate. Some foxes actually made it to the Outer Bank, but the paint had washed off. So
Not surprising.
yeah, there were variables which you'd think would have occurred to them, but
I got to say, this book sounds ridiculous, but it also sounds entertaining.
I highly recommend this book. And it's not all dirty tricks. Some of it is about assassination attempts. It gets sinister in parts because Stanley Lovell went on to really embrace the possibilities of chemical warfare in later life. And it seeded some sinister goings-on, certainly, in the CIA. But I would highly recommend it. It's a propulsive read. And I would recommend the review, too, because Ben McIntyre is a fun writer who does full justice to this entertaining material.
Excellent.
Gilbert, what are you reading?
Oh, well, thank you for
Did you need
asking.
somebody to, yeah.
Thank you for asking. I have been listening for maybe a month and a half to the Prince Harry memoir read by him in audiobook form. And it is Like, I know we had a first wave of coverage where it was a lot of, this isn't that great. But listening to him read it is just fantastic. I am not someone who really followed a lot of this stuff when it happened in real time. I don't read a lot of royal gossip, so most of this is new to me. And it's great. He's a great reader. He's self-effacing. There's the whole section about his penis getting frostbite, and listening to him read that is amazing. I just got to the part where he has met Meghan Markle, and they're trying to secret themselves away for their first few dates. I don't know why I started, but I know why I'm continuing it, because it's wonderful. I like listening to this guy. Why does anyone have a problem with it? The Duke of Sussex is great.
So it's really working.
It's
this
absolutely,
PR offensive.
I'm such a sucker. It is working for me. I spoke to a friend of mine who really does follow the royals and remembers all this stuff when it first happened, all this stuff in the tabloids. And she was like, like it's sort of a rehash of stuff. But if you're coming to this fresh for the first time, it is quite juicy.
Well, that was my question. Even just from reading the coverage, which seemed to excerpt all the juiciest bits, including the frostbite incident, do you learn much more?
Well, when you say learn, what do you? It's not. I mean, his life is interesting because he's a prince, but it doesn't feel important or essential. It's just like a peek into the life of someone who leads a very odd existence in the 21st century.
And it sounds like you do feel this is a case where it's a memoir best read by the author.
Absolutely. Clearly he has experience speaking in public and the like, but he's quite good. Of course, he didn't write the book. He had a ghostwriter, J.R. Moehringer, an amazing ghostwriter who took Harry's stories, wrote them down, and then Harry is sort of reading those stories about him back to readers. It's this amazing refractory experience, but I think he's doing a great job.
Well, they say there's material for another volume, which I can only imagine rivals the NDA in length.
I don't know where this ends. Does anyone here? Can you help me?
I have no idea.
Okay.
I have no idea.
Okay. Well, if he reads it, I'll be there.
Let me know.
I'll be there.
He sounds very genial on the clips that I've heard shared on Twitter of him reading aloud choice bits.
He has a good voice. You can tell he's done therapy work. Like, he talks a lot.
He's done the work.
He's done the work. And so it's inspiring me. Well, everyone, this has been a great conversation. I want to gather this same group in like 3 months and get an update on what everyone is reading or listening to. Thanks for joining today. Jen, thank you.
Thank you, Gilbert.
Sadie, thank you.
Thank you.
Joumana, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
A quick heads up, next week is spring break, and I'm going to take some time off, which means that you will not hear a new episode of the Book Review Podcast for 2 weeks. But do not worry, we will be back. I look forward to joining you once again. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the Book Review. Thank you for listening.